Welcome to the Happy Lawyer Project. I'm your host, Akoma Moronu, and I created this show to help lawyers find happiness in life with a law degree. Together with my guests, we provide the knowledge, skills, insight, inspiration, and encouragement you need to find your happy. On today's show, I chat with Katie Young from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She recently conducted a really interesting study of over 1,000 law school students from over 100 law schools across the country to learn more about why we are so freaking unhappy during law school. She shares a lot of her interesting findings and also proposes some solutions for how to make law school a little bit less miserable. And a lot of the things she shares today, I think, are really applicable whether you're in law school or well out of law school. So I really hope you guys will enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Happy Lawyer Project, lawyers. I am very excited to be chatting with a fellow happiness researcher, would I call you? I don't know. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Akoma.
So I don't know the best way to describe your interest in happiness, so I'd love if you could just start with a brief description of who you are and what it is that you do.
Sure. Well, I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I have a JD as well as a PhD, and I work in the sociology department there. I teach a variety of classes related to policing, surveillance, evidence, social psychology. I study how law itself works on the ground, but also how people think about the law. And a lot of my work is qualitative, meaning I get to get out there and talk to people and even live with them. And I've done research on everything from parole commissioners to Hawaiian cockfighters to, for this book, law students.
That's so interesting. I always think that in another life I would have loved being a sociologist. So fascinating.
It is a really interesting life, I have to say. I'm very pleased to be in it.
Yeah, and I'm really excited. I think later on the show, I really want to dive into the lifestyle part because I do think that people fantasize about that job. I can't imagine I'm the only one. But before we go there, I want to talk about the book that you recently wrote, which is called How to Be Sort of Happy in Law School.
That's right.
Can you tell me a little bit about the background of how you decided to write this book? I mean, I suspect that you didn't write it because you were so happy during law school that you wanted to just share your awesome experience, but I could be wrong.
Well, you're partly right about that. I had a love-hate relationship with law school, as I suspect a lot of your listeners do. On one hand, I liked the substance of a lot of what I was learning, especially related to criminal law, constitutional law, and much to my surprise, property. But I disliked a lot about law school as well. And so I did my JD and my PhD at Stanford at the same place. And so I started my JD first. And my law school class graduated in 2007. But I was around for, 5 years after that or something, finishing my PhD, and got to see a lot of patterns in law students. I got to see, new classes come in, have the same anxieties, and leave. I got to know friends who were in a very wide variety of law school experiences. And that experience of being kind of in law school for effectively 8 years in and out really got me interested in the law student experience. And I remember thinking, I sure wish that there was something that I could have read or learned about that would help me make sense of my own experience. Now that I'm understanding more about different law students' experience, sort of what can I do to give back? What, can I write the book that I wish I could have read? And so that's what I set out to do.
The thing that I really, really appreciate about your book is obviously you're a legit PhD, but I think a lot of people, they kind of have these anecdotal stories about their own experience, and then they talk to a few people they know, but you actually conducted a survey and tracked students. Can you tell me a little bit about that process and how, I know so little about science, how you go about setting up an experiment like that or a research like that?
Yeah, well, I bet you know more than you think you know. I was really trying to get a broad cross-section of students. So, I went to Stanford. Stanford is, like any law school, idiosyncratic in various ways. So I thought probably my experiences were, interesting maybe to people at a handful of law schools that, are sort of like Stanford or, for a handful of people that are sort of like me. But when I really wanted to delve into the law student experience, it was important for me to get a broad cross-section of, race, class, gender, law school tier, and everything like that. So I did a survey of over 1,000 law students from over 100 different U.S. law schools. I also interviewed 25 law students in great depth, like 1 to 3 hour interviews. I interviewed alums. I interviewed people who had dropped out of law school. I visited, I don't remember, 12 or 14 or something law schools and talked with, everyone from professors to librarians to custodial staff, really trying to get a snapshot of the law student experience.
That sounds so fascinating and so unbelievably thorough. So what surprised you the most in your results? I'm sure that you went into it having certain assumptions based on your own experience, but what did you learn?
Yeah. Well, one thing that really surprised me. So, Tolstoy in the beginning of Anna Karenina has this, famous quote that all happy families look alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And I expected to find this among law students, that the ones who were unhappy were all unhappy for very different reasons. And this was sort of true to the extent that we're all leading different lives, and we all have our own experiences. But by and large, I was surprised at how similar law students' unhappiness was, how many common themes there were, regardless of race or class or practice area or what tier of law school they were at. You might think that people who have really low amount of loans are more likely to be happy, or that people who, come from a family of lawyers and really know what they're getting into are more likely to be happy. But really, the unhappiness was fairly common across the board. And the similarity of really different students' experience was surprising to me and also kind of inspiring in a weird way, because it made me think there actually is potential to reach a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life and make their law school experience better.
So what were I could probably guess, what do you think are the key drivers of the anxiety and the stress and the unhappiness that law school students seem to be feeling across the board?
Well, there are a number of them. I think so I'll just name a few key things. For one, one thing that you've mentioned in previous interviews, or maybe I'm misremembering, maybe it was one of your guests who mentioned it. I was talking about how you enter law school being sort of at the top of your class, and then you get to law school and everyone's sort of as smart as you are. I think that just sense of, oh my gosh, if you've derived a sense of self-worth and a sense of purpose from being really good at academics, and then you go into a different situation and everyone is just as good as you are. It's a bit cliched, but I think that can be really, really hard. You're told your whole life that a B is totally fine, but if you've never seen one on your transcript, it's really hard. So I think that's tough for a lot of people. The actual structure of law school classes and law school learning, I think, is maybe the most important factor. So, one thing I say in the book is, imagine if you got a new job and your boss said, all right, you've never done any of this kind of work before, but what I'd like you to do is all of it, and you have 4 months. And in 4 months, I'm going to check and see how you're doing with a test. And you're not going to get any feedback. I'm just going to talk at you about it. And, we'll see how you do. Like, that would be a terrible way to teach someone. But that's exactly what we do to law students. I don't think it's a great way to teach. I think a lot of, the pedagogy is really problematic. So I think there's that. I think there's, especially now, I think that for students outside of, the very, very top ranked law schools, they're often graduating from law school with a fair amount of debt, not sure how they're going to pay it off. That's extremely stressful. I think this sort of confluence of characteristics about law school just makes it a place where risk-averse type A folks hanging out mostly amongst themselves, it's a recipe for stress. It's a recipe for unhappiness.
You make it sound so inviting.
Well, I did say I have a love-hate relationship with law school. So believe it or not, there is a lot of love too. I think law school can be cool and exciting and a place to find yourself. And I did meet some of the coolest, most interesting, creative, thoughtful people I've ever met. I met in law school. And so, I think there's so much that's good about law school, but I think there's also so much that's bad that doesn't have to be bad, that doesn't have to make people unhappy, and that could make law school a more open place for people from different backgrounds. I mean, one thing I remember being told before I went to law school is, don't worry about it. No one really knows what they're doing. Everyone feels kind of lost in law school. But, we know from surveys of people in law school, that's actually not true. Some people do come in kind of knowing what they're doing. If you've had lawyers in your family, if you're from, a certain kind of background, if you have a certain amount of cultural capital, law school is an easier place for you in a variety of ways. And so I think that there are ways that law school could be a gateway to a more open profession, a profession that's more oriented toward problem solving. But I don't think we're there yet. And I just think there's a lot of room for law school to be better.
No, I completely agree. And I think just being able to take a critical eye to the place where we grow our baby lawyers is a necessary part of the profession. And I completely take your point on, the cultural capital component. I think I had never really, and maybe this is my own naivete, but I had never really thought about it much until I started law school and I went to a Balsa event. It was the first time I'd ever been to an event like that. And we were just talking about backgrounds and stuff. And they were having people raise their hands so that people could figure out if they had any background in common. And it occurred to me that I was the only really person in the room who hadn't gone to an Ivy League undergrad.
Wow. Yeah.
And the only person who hadn't been really in prep school my whole life. And
yep.
I never really thought about it. And I was like, that's weird.
Yeah. It's interesting. And so I'm curious. So for you, was that sort of startling? Was that how did you sort of reconcile that? Or did you feel like everyone finds their place in law school? It ended up being fine.
I think I'm very lucky in that I've moved a lot my whole life.
Right.
So my whole life has been, and growing up biracial, kind of all over the world, my whole life has been an exercise in being different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that my resilience in that regard is much higher probably than the average person.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as disruptive to my sense of self. That's actually a core part of who I am, is different. But that was the first time that I felt different intellectually. And I'm lucky to come from two cultures where people probably have an overinflated sense of their intellect. So I always like to tell people that the thing I get from my Nigerian side is believing that I can be anything. And the thing I get from my Chinese side is believing I can do anything.
That's a wonderful combination.
Correct. And so I perhaps have grown up to be a little bit more optimistic, and not in that it's very different from the American dream kind of bootstrap mentality.
Yeah.
So, and these are all realizations that I've really only come to in my adulthood. I definitely was not as a child being I can be anything and I can do anything,
Yeah, well, I love what you're saying because, I think one of the really important ways that we could change legal education, the legal profession, is for people to realize that the places they come from, regardless of what they are, aren't just weaknesses. I mean, anything turned on its head can be a strength. And, one thing that I saw, I come from what I would call a working class background. And, one thing that I noticed in law school was that when I was working at a housing law clinic, for example, I had no problem relating to my clients. It just didn't seem strange. They seemed really their sort of concerns, their worries, the ways that they talked, these all seemed totally normal to me. And I noticed that some of my peers who had been raised differently had really a hard time connecting with people. Not all of them, but some did. And you could so easily have framed your background as a weakness, but I think you're absolutely right that it's strength. I moved a bunch growing up a lot too. I moved something like 10 times before high school. And I have to say that it felt like a weakness at the time. But going into law school, you realize that, you can actually connect with lots of different kinds of people because you've had to do this your entire life. You had to code switch. that part isn't new to you. So for me, it's like maybe I didn't understand a lot about how law school functioned. Maybe I didn't understand that everyone was going to use commercial outlines. But I did understand code switching. That's not something that was new. I think just teaching students to reframe, and really lawyers to reframe where they're coming from as a strength can be very powerful.
So I'm sure that your book is not, based on the title alone, intended to just identify the problems which are prevalent in the law school, system, but you also try to focus on providing some solutions and, strategies for students to manage the stress and unhappiness. We can't obviously divulge your entire book in the short time that we have, but at a high level, what do you propose in the book are the key elements to being happier in law school?
Some things that could make law school happier are the kinds of things we're talking about, the structure of law school itself. But I did really write the book for students who are, on the ground now in imperfect systems and figuring out how they can make themselves have a happier life. And I think there are a number of things they can do. So one thing students can do, I think, is to recognize risk aversion. People in law school tend to be obsessed with the idea of keeping their options open.
No, I talk about this all the time. I'm like, why do you want so many options? Options actually lead to paralysis. You need less options. Like, why do you want to have the option to be an animal doctor? You don't want to be an animal doctor.
You don't need that option. Yes, it's knowing which options you're keeping open and why. So the idea that you're doing law review to keep your options open, it's like, what option exactly is that keeping open, and why do you want to keep it open? One of my favorite people, Pam Carlin, who teaches at Stanford, once said, the goal of life is not to die with as many options open as possible. And I couldn't agree more. There's no reason
I love that. Yeah.
Sort of, collect options like they're something in and of themselves. But I think it can be a way to avoid making decisions. And like you're saying, cutting off options can actually make you happier. There's this, famous study, social psychology study about jam. You may have heard of this study.
Yes.
So the jam study. Do you want me to summarize the jam study? Okay,
Please.
So the jam study is basically like people in a supermarket, you give them samples, and the whole setup is you give them samples of different jams, you see how likely they are to buy jams. Well, there's one thing that's switched in the two iterations of the jam study. So in one scenario, people can sample 3 different kinds of jam, and in one scenario, people can sample something like 14 different kinds of jam. And you would think that the more jams you sample, 14 jams, you're going to find a jam you like. You're way more likely to find your jam, right? But not so. In fact, people are something like twice as likely to buy jam if they only sample 3. And this paradox of choice has been replicated in many different ways in social psychology studies.
It's so fascinating. And I think that people only, at least for me, understood the impact of decision fatigue and talking about it. I feel like I didn't start talking about it until maybe 10 years ago. And that was, too late. I was already decisioned out.
Well, and it's hard too, because we also tell people to, and this is something you talk about a lot in your podcast, and I talk about a lot in the book, which is that keeping an open mind is really important. You would not have discovered, I'm imagining, aviation law if you didn't keep an open mind. I wouldn't have discovered sociology if I hadn't kept an open mind. And yet that's different from keeping as many options open as possible, because you're keeping your mind open to specific, new, interesting things on the horizon.
Yeah, I think that I always think of the saying, strong beliefs held loosely. And that's kind of how you have to feel about your life. You have to have kind of a clear vision of what you want your life to look like, but not be committed to it at the expense of possibly other iterations of it. And I know that's hard to understand when you're not in that headspace. But when you get there, you understand why it allows your life to flow so much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. And that dovetails into what I would say is a third key takeaway for law school happiness, which is that to understand that there are a lot of right ways to do law school. one theme that I saw over and over in my surveys from law students was the sense that they're not doing law school quite right, that there's an ideal way, and the ideal way involves law review and moot court and, being the editor of a journal, and that's just not true, that there are lots of right ways, and your job is to find your right way. It's not that there's an ideal way and all these other ways fall short. It's that there are 1,000 different paths, and you have to find the one that's going to, allow you to be fully yourself.
That's so great. I remember early in my career or early in law school realizing that I had to pick between prioritizing learning and prioritizing appearing to be learning.
That's a great distinction.
I was like, what is driving me here? Am I here to learn as much as I can and build these relationships and get as much as I can out of law school? Or am I here to get the best grades and build the best resume I can? Because that doesn't always overlap. And when you come to those crossroads, you need to know why you're there.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely true. And that's one way in which law school is set up in a way that makes it difficult for students. I mean, often I think law students read for class basically to defend themselves against cold call assaults, as opposed to learn and understand the larger structure of the type of law that they're learning.
And, I could really go into the rabbit hole on this one because I feel so strongly about it. But I would also say that from an employment perspective, I did recruiting for every year that I was in big law, and every day of the week, I would rather read the resume of and interview a person who had an interesting resume that they could defend and showed an intentionality about their time at law school versus the same law review, moot court, good grades, because that person doesn't tell me anything about who they are and what they'll be like to work with, and that they will be able to drive their career once they get to the firm.
I think that's 100% true.
So in thinking about that, do you think that the tips for happiness in law school are really that different for tips for life after law school? How do you think they will serve people whether or not they're in law school currently?
Yeah, well, I've heard from a few law school alums who've read the book, and they say that they're surprised how much of it relates to them. So I found that very, very pleasing. I think that there are definitely tips and strategies, maybe most of the book that actually is translatable to life after law school, in part because, law school is not exactly like legal practice, but it shares enough things with legal practice, and it shares enough in terms of patterns of lawyer anxiety and depression with legal practice that I think some of the sort of mindfulness practices and ways of thinking as a lawyer really are the same in law school versus legal practice. So one example is to adopt a growth mindset. So when you are terrible at something or believe that you're terrible about something, to reframe it as not being good at this thing yet. Just in the same way that you wouldn't call a freshman in high school stupid because they don't understand chemistry immediately. You shouldn't consider yourself stupid because you get a D on your first brief. You're not good at it yet. It's not a skill that you have yet. And I think also something that goes along with that is avoiding universal thinking. A number of students that I interviewed and surveyed said things like, oh, I really hate cold calls, so I know I won't like appellate litigation. And I just thought, oh, no. That made me so sad, right? Universalizing that. Cold calls are nothing like oral advocacy. They share very little in common except that you're talking about the law to an authority figure. Aside from that, not a lot of similarities. So, I think just being willing to try things, you might hate and fear and even be poor at cold calls, but that might mean that moot court is actually, sort of how oral advocacy is going to work for you. Or, I even hear people in legal practice say things like, I always hated it talking in law school, so I knew I could never be a trial lawyer. Those two things don't follow each other. If you don't want to be a trial lawyer, fine, don't be. But don't think that because, you hated cold calls, you'll hate being a trial lawyer. Another kind of tip or strategy that I think translates well to life after law school is to find at least one thing that you really like to do each week and to be fully present while you're doing it. I'm very big on mindfulness. And so I asked law students and actually law school alums as well to tell me the time in the past week when they had been the happiest. And almost without fail, it was some really small thing that they were doing. Like, I played fetch with my dog, or I rode my motorcycle, or I gave my husband a back massage, or, something really little like that. And what made that a happy time for them was that they weren't thinking about the brief they had due while they were doing it. They were fully present in the non-law related thing they were doing, which then allows them to be more fully present in, their work life while they're at work. So I think it's very hard to do. And in the book, I give a lot of tips for how to cultivate mindfulness in yourself. But I think that that's a life skill that really the value of which can't be replaced with anything else. It's just so useful.
I mean, I've been loving kind of at least what I believe to be the mainstreaming of mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And I see more of it on college campus, on law school campuses, at law firms, and just in the legal space, which I think the profession needs. The question I have for you, and I might be slicing this too thin, is how do you reconcile for the kind of neurotic type A law school student the advice not to keep too many options open with the advice not to make universal principles about? Because I could see someone saying, well, you told me not to keep my options open, which is why I said I don't like cold calling, so I canceled out this whole area of things.
Yeah, it's a great question because these two things do seem to be at odds. But I feel like where they're not at odds is, I think that there's a difference between not universalizing and keeping your options open. So, for example, universal thinking would be, I'm not good at cold calls, so I won't like oral advocacy. But keeping your options open would be like, I better do well at cold calls so that, some professor will write me a recommendation to do oral advocate. Like, it's sort of utilitarian thinking versus being willing to follow your nose. So doing everything for utilitarian reasons is what I see more as keeping your options open. Also, when you're keeping your options open, you're not usually, most people aren't usually, when they say that, thinking about a specific option. They're not thinking about, well, I think I want to take criminal procedure too because I might want to be a DA and that would be useful. It's more of a general, I want to take criminal procedure too because that will look good on my transcript and keep options open. Well, that's not very careful thinking. That's just being risk averse. I think that sort of being willing to keep an open mind is thinking that, like, that little thing in the back of your head that says, I might kind of like land use law. I think I might take that class, even though it seems totally weird and I'm on the path to do something different. That's kind of following your gut or following your intuition and keeping an open mind. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think it really does come back to having like an intentionality and a purpose or behind what you're doing, as opposed to just kind of falling into these defaults, which so many of us do.
Yeah, and it's hard not to. I think that this is why so many people end up on the big firm track without really thinking about it, because it's sort of like the path that you don't have to think about that much. At least at many law schools, it's kind of the path of least resistance, which is not to say that it's not a great path for some people. I think it really can be. But if you're doing it because it seems like the safe path, you might think a little more deeply about why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, I think that that's a great place to leave that, because I do want to spend a little bit, just a couple minutes, talking about kind of what you do in your work, because I know that there are members of my audience who think about possibly doing research or teaching, and I so rarely get to have an academic on the on the podcast. So can you just share a little bit about how you got into it and kind of what that's like for you day to day?
Sure. Well, I got into academia in sort of a roundabout way, not at all by design. I had never taken a sociology class before. But I had a wonderful criminal procedure professor at Stanford Law, Bob Weisberg, who we were talking after class one day. I think I was asking him about some case. I was always very interested in criminal procedure. I think I was asking him about like the social class implications of some decision. Why didn't the Supreme Court even consider how this was going to affect poor people? And he said, a lot of the questions you're asking in class aren't just legal, they're sociological. And we're starting a JD PhD program, and you should think about applying. And I had never taken a sociology class before, like I said, so this seemed like a crazy idea to me. But it also seemed a little bit interesting because at the time I was questioning whether I really wanted to practice law. I had entered law school positive that I wanted to be a public defender. And after working at a federal defender's office, I felt my resolve to do that slip a little bit. It seemed interesting, but it didn't seem like it would be sustaining for me for a career. So I thought, all right, I'll give it a shot. Why not? What's the downside? It was sort of a follow your gut moment. And, I trusted this professor, didn't think he'd steer me totally wrong, and I could quit if I hated a PhD program. So whatever. So I did. I tried it. And actually law ended up being a much better fit once sociology was in the mix for me. Most people with law degrees and with JD PhDs end up teaching at law schools. And this was something I thought about quite a lot as well. I interviewed at several law schools, and I applied to sociology departments as well as law schools. And ultimately, I decided that I could be happy with either path, and also that it's possible to switch teaching paths if I wanted to. So I just chose based on the school. I didn't expect to teach in a sociology department. I didn't expect to live on the East Coast, but I just had a really good feeling when I visited the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I decided to follow my gut.
I like how simple you make it all sound, follow your gut.
Yeah, it's not simple at all. Well, and one thing I talk about in the book is if you're lucky enough to have a gut feeling, follow it. I think the hard thing is when you really don't know, what your gut feeling is. You ask what it's like to work on a college campus, and I've got to tell you, I absolutely love it. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do as far as work. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a public defender or go into appellate law. I actually absolutely love working on appeals. I think it's really fascinating. What I did know about myself is that I wanted a job where I had lots of variety, where I could read a lot, I could think about ideas a lot. I'm terrible about if someone is telling me what to think about all day long, I become very cranky. And I couldn't have a job like that. And so because at least I knew that much about myself, I was able to narrow it down to, some collection of jobs that would meet, those needs, those requirements for me. And practicing certain kinds of law was not one of those options. So it's kind of what you talked about when narrowing your options. I knew that, I like to work super hard, but I also like to make my own schedule. The whole dressing up and showing up at the same time every day and going home at the same time every day, someone telling me what I was going to think about all day, I didn't like that. So I was willing to sacrifice things like, pay or, my favorite location that I wanted to be in, which was Northern California, or, other things, because I was going to be able to get these things that felt like they were really at the core of who I am. And I've got to say, I love my job so much. I never thought I'd have a job where I woke up every day really excited to go to work, but I literally am. So I feel incredibly lucky. But, like most good things in life, I feel like I can't take that much credit for it. I feel like I just sort of did what seemed like a good idea at the time and then left it something that seemed like it might be a good fit.
One of the things I took from everything you said is that a lot of people probably need to develop a more robust and nuanced sense of what they're looking for in a job.
Mm-hmm.
I think so many people kind of fall back on the really traditional, like something intellectually challenging where I get to work with good people and like grow like professionally, like all of these like interview appropriate things to say about your career.
Right. Yeah, it's so not appropriate to tell a law firm that you want a job where you can wear jeans every day. So really thinking about what you need in a job, I totally agree, going beyond that kind of interview level, what you want in a job. And one thing that helped me do that was like a personality inventory type thing called Strengths Quest, which I really liked and found super useful. And it helped me think about, that was what helped me realize, I like deciding my own intellectual agenda for the day. Strengths Quest was good for me because it helped me put what I really needed at the forefront and prioritize. And also to think more deeply about, I mean, I want to work with good people. Yeah, everyone wants to work with good, smart people. But what do you want to do with these good, smart people, right? Do you want to collaborate? Do you want to sit in meetings all day? Do you want to manage them? Do you want to be managed by them? How many hours a day do you want to be spending with other people versus alone? Sort of all of these things really, really matter, or at least really matter to me. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of what I hear law students talk about is, I want an interesting job with good people.
Yep. As opposed to all the people who want uninteresting jobs with terrible people.
Exactly.
It's such a fair point. And I think that once you get to the point where you know those things, it's so much easier to articulate them in an appropriate way in an interview. Because to be honest, I'm somebody who does not like routine. Mm-hmm. And the way that worked out for me in big laws, I worked on the capital market side on transactions. And so my transactions were really hot and fast and intense, but they weren't all the time. And so sometimes it'd be crazy. Other times it'd be really slow when things were busy, so it gave me a lot of variety because I got to learn about lots of different industries, but also specialize in one way in which I worked. And I got very lucky in that it was a really good fit for my personality. And so when coming in-house, once I had the job, was able to say to my GC, my biggest concern is I don't want a 9-to-5 job, which I think for most people going in-house is like the dream.
Yeah. So how did your GC respond to that? I would have been scared to say that in an interview.
Well, this was because I already had the job, and I said,
got it.
And he had recruited me, and so I knew he really liked me. And I said, I'm really interested in this position, but I'm worried it's not a great fit because I don't think I'm well suited for like a 9-to-5 clock in, clock out type of role. Right. And he said, and he was right. The nature of what I do, I manage kind of a global team. And so because so much of what I do is managing teams in other time zones, there's this expectation every day that it is going to be 9-to-5. So I am going to have a lot of flexibility and freedom to manage my time the way the team needs me to, because if I'm on calls with Australia all night, they're not going to expect me to come in and sit at my desk from 9-to-5 and just do FaceTime when all the busy work is in Australia. And so that was very reassuring, but I knew that about myself. And I think there are some people who just assume that 9-to-5 will be better.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'm that way too. I mean, I can work a 12-hour day and I can work a 4-hour day. And that's so much better for me than working an 8-hour day every day. I don't like my days to be that routinized. So, I can totally relate. And I think that also, I mean, if you had hated your job, if your job had ended up really being 9-to-5 and didn't fit your personality, I bet you would have simply quit it and found something else, right?
Oh, absolutely. That it just wouldn't have, it doesn't work for my personality. I would just have gotten bored. And I think he knew that about me. And that was a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
And that's what you want, right? Like you want who you are and what you're looking for to align with what the business is or the place of employment and what they're looking for. So Absolutely. Lying to them and lying to yourself serves nobody.
And I totally agree. And feeling like you have to hide parts of your personality or parts of who you are to fit the job. I think it's more about making the job fit you or finding, a job that already fits you. And also just having the courage to leave. I mean, which a lot of lawyers do. You probably know about the After the JD study, which was a really big canvas of post JD folks and what their work lives look like and their, satisfaction with their jobs and all of that. It's a really terrific study and 3 very robust reports have come out of it. One thing that surprised me though from those results was the frequency with which lawyers do change jobs. There are some people who get their first job and sort of hang on to it, but it really is pretty common for people to try a bunch of things. So I think trying something that seems like, a weird path or, a strange place to live or a weird little area of law is not something that we should be scared of. It's becoming normalized to, quit your job and find something else. And I think that starting with, at least in my interviews with and surveys of law school alums, of which there are about 250, the people who started kind of with a keep your options open attitude, like I'll just work at a law firm and then I can do whatever I want. Those people ended up a lot less happy than people who started with, the weird animal law, place in Virginia, or the weird, something that seemed strange that people were like, you're going to do that. Whether they stayed at that job or not, taking the interesting path seemed to serve people so much better than taking the safe path. So I would really encourage listeners to do that regardless of what career stage they're at.
I love that advice. I think it's so important. And a guest once told me that you should sometimes look at the things that you're most jealous of or annoyed by in other people and consider why that is. Perhaps there's something in it that you wish you could have for yourself. And I think the reason I say that is because I think we often criticize that person who in law school or at the law firm who we say is not taking it seriously because they're not doing it the way everybody else is doing it. And how are they ever going to get a job? They're just taking all these fun classes that they like, and they're not taking all of these like black letter law classes that you're supposed to take. How are they ever going to like make a partner? Because they're just doing the deals they want to do, and they're not, And those people are just laughing all the way to the bank. They're just happy as can be because they're living life on their own terms. And once I learned how to do a little bit more of that, I realized what they were onto.
Yeah, I agree.
So how can people get a copy of the book?
Well, you can find it, How to Be Sort of Happy in Law School, on Amazon or any of the usual places. You can also go to, I have a website for the book, sortofhappy.com. If you want to reach out to me with a question, have me come talk at your law school or workplace, which I do all the time, or check out the list of resources I keep on the website for law students and lawyers. I'm always updating this resource list. So, definitely check it out at sortofhappy.com. And I hope your listeners will feel free to find me. I sort of see the book as a way to open conversations.
I will include all of that information in the show notes for anybody who is driving to work or on the subway or doing anything else and can't get to that right now. But I just want to say a huge thank you for being on the show today and sharing your story and all your super interesting research. And before I let you go, I have a last question, which I ask everybody who comes on the show, and that is, what do you believe separates happy lawyers from lawyers who struggle to find happiness in life with a law degree?
Well, first, I want to say I'm so glad you're doing the project. I really think it has the power to open people's sense about what a life in the law is all about. It's such a hard question, and I know you ask it. I know you ask it a lot. I'm not sure that I have a great answer. I think that what separates happy lawyers from lawyers who are struggling to find happiness is, I think that people who are happy have a sense that they are on a track, to do something. They see themselves as in a state of becoming, in the middle of a process of becoming a person, and they're enjoying it along the way. Like they're enjoying every stage that they're at. They're fully there. I think that lawyers who struggle to find happiness are not as in touch with,
not as on purpose.
Exactly. Not as much in a state of becoming, but more see themselves as, more sort of that stereotypical on a treadmill, or once I find that right job, I will find happiness, or, they're always trying to get to the next thing rather than being present in the thing that they're doing at the time.
I love that so much. Thanks so much, Katie.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.